Welcome to the JC podcast, a podcast where we explore and unpack life topics in a confusing and fast-changing world. As you might be able to tell by my voice, I am not your host, James. I'm not your usual host. My name is Lachlan. Nice to meet you. I am a friend of James, and today I have the pleasure of guest hosting and guest interviewing the interviewer. And I'll explain a bit about that in a minute. But yeah, today I'm going to be turning the tables and interviewing James. Hello, James.
Hi.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for
and thanks for having me.
No, thanks for having me. Yeah.
Do you want to explain how we met or how we're friends?
Yeah. So I think a lot of, if you guys have been listening for a while, you know that I went to a conference in KL called ARG, the Alpha Regional Gathering, and we pretty much technically didn't meet first time there.
Yep,
we met at
a bit before,
Flow
a few
Church.
days before.
Literally, yeah, a few days before. But yeah, we met. We essentially got to know each other through that. Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah, so so I'm part of Flow Church, which James has been coming along to for a couple of months.
Yeah, about
until
2.5,
recently.
3. Yep.
And yeah, so we've had the pleasure of having James there with us for a bit, and I work part-time at Flow Church as a ministry assistant, and and so been hanging out a bit the last few months, and we've talked about, are there any sort of topics that I could come on and as a guest on a podcast, and the story is I'm studying theology. And this semester, one of the subjects I'm doing is a subject in pastoral care. And one of the assignments I have is that I have to interview a pastor. And I had this crazy idea, hey, James is a pastor, and James interviews people on his podcast. And if I'm going to interview someone, I'm probably going to want to record it because that way I can refer back to it. So why not do an interview with James and record that, and then maybe throw that up as a podcast episode.
Yeah.
And
the funny thing was that I was thinking similar. Like, I was just like, oh, I wonder what it would look like if somebody actually interviewed me on my podcast. Like, would that be weird, or like, what would that? Yeah. So it was just good timing with it. So as it's meant to be, I guess.
So we will find out if it's weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, so listeners, I hope you enjoy this. But either way, I'm getting work done just by being here. I'm killing multiple birds with one stone.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, we can just get into it, I guess.
Yeah.
So the kind of purpose of the interview from the perspective of my assignment is to interview a pastor, and particularly a pastor who's involved in pastoring people of a certain life stage. Yeah. And James, you are a young adult pastor, basically, and to sort of ask your thoughts on what, like, the nature of being a pastor and pastoral care, and kind of just I'm also just keen to hear a bit of your story. Audience, you probably won't know which questions are coming from the assignment and which questions are just coming from my own personal curiosity.
Yeah,
so
it's good, natural. Let's just let it flow. Yeah,
But so the first question I want to ask is how you became a pastor. Yeah. I don't know how long it will take you to answer that. It might need to go back to like when you were born or when you became a Christian or like. Yeah.
So I like to generally give a condensed stories, but I think it started like would be 2013. So that was like my second year uni. So at that time I was a youth leader, and we were going to a Christian conference, and as part of a youth leader, we had all our youth there. It was mainly targeted to youth, I think, but not really. So from that, we were me and this other leader were in charge of looking after these youth, and I think the funny thing at that time was that the youth at that time, especially the boys and that were in there, were pretty much about to leave. They were like, after, if nothing happened, like they were just going to stop coming to youth. And so we're praying really hard. And long story short, there was like a sermon that happened, and I felt led to, place my hand on a guy next to me. Like, it was a friend, but also a youth, and during worship. And I was like, God, this is really weird. I don't want to do this. But anyway, stepped out in obedience, and then he began to have an encounter with the Holy Spirit. And one thing led to another, began to pray for people, pray for him. And literally the whole room just broke out with the filling of the Spirit and like people encountering God, which was amazing. And from that experience, I was like, man, God used me for the very first time in a very tangible way to touch the life of somebody. And I think I had this moment where I was like, man, there's nothing more I would rather do with the rest of my life than to serve God and for God to use me in this way. And so that was kind of the start of it. And then I think it was that night or a few days later, God reminded me of this vision. I think I call it a vision, but I don't want you guys to think it's like some like super holy thing. But it was literally just an image that I had of the previous year's church camp, where I was just like, man, it would have been like, just had this image of like the youth boys in particular, just like on their knees, like worshiping God. And I was like, man, how awesome would that be if I saw that? But I didn't think much of it. But then God reminded me, and that's exactly what happened on that day.
Wow.
And I was just like, wow, okay, this is really interesting. And so from then I was like, okay, I knew that I wanted to go into ministry, and that was my call to ministry.
Wow.
But then I was still studying. I was still, I was studying a Bachelor of Film and Digital Media. And so I was like, what do I do with that? Do I continue? And so I decided to just finish that off with the advice of my parents. They're like, get a degree. Very, very Asian.
Yeah.
And after that, I was in the space of like, what do I do? I was like, do I pursue, getting some secular experience, in the workplace? Because I hadn't really worked in the secular workplace before. So worked at a bit at different jobs, doing different things. And then I was like, I think it's time to go Bible college. So went to MST, studied for 2.5 years while also volunteering at church. And then, from there, I got offered, after I finished MST, I got offered a role as very similar to yours, ministry and technical support, 2 days a week. And then once COVID hit, it just happened to coincide. I was added for 3 days, initially for our Saturday service, but then because COVID hit, I ended up using those 3 days to do live streaming. Putting my degree to use.
Yeah, right. As in live streaming your services.
Correct.
Making that happen.
Correct, yeah. So like all these cameras and all these lighting, all a product of live streaming. And then 2021 became full-time young adults pastor. So not a lot of people know this, but like at that point, I think at the start of 2021, I had decided that I was going to step down from ministry and actually pursue secular work. I just felt that at the church, there wasn't really anything that was, I didn't feel necessarily excited about anything. And so I was like, maybe now is the time for me to actually get secular experience, because I found that, because I was at NAB for like 6 months, and I found that really valuable, just being in that workplace and getting, just knowing how the average member would feel going to work, and, because obviously I'm, in a church, you're in a Christian environment. So I told the board, but then they're like, oh, we need you to, we made this role, which we're going to get someone to fill, but we need you to second in it while we find somebody. And so this brand new role called the Youth and Young Adults role, pastor role. And because it was, we did some leadership restructuring, and it was overseeing different ministries. And I really loved that overseeing role, which I didn't know. So when I was in, I was just like, I actually really like this. Like, this is really exciting. And so I was like trying to then think through, should I apply for this? Like, should I scrap my plan? And so obviously I did apply for it and got the job. And so I was there. So I've been full-time since 2021 September. And then obviously 2024 hit burnout. And so that's kind of where I'm here. That's my journey as how I became a pastor. Yeah, cool. It's a little bit long, but yeah.
And that's all this took place in the church you grew up in?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. Born into this church?
Pretty well. Technically yes, and technically no. Like Lifegate Church is two churches that integrated.
right.
So I essentially grew up in one of the churches that formed Lifegate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. I find that really cool how your initial vision was to do with people worshiping God. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I've sort of thought about the kind of call to ministry in those terms sort of more recently as like
Yeah.
out of a zeal for
Yeah.
God to be worshipped.
Correct. Yeah.
To do ministry for that reason, among maybe other reasons, but yeah, I think that's cool.
100%. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So I guess we can get into sort of the one of the main questions I want to ask you about, which is about the nature of pastoral care, and what pastoral care is. And so, my question is, how would you define pastoral care? And I just had to do an essay for the pastoral care subject a few weeks ago where I had to answer this question. Did you have to do the same essay when you did this subject?
No, I can't remember. I just remember I had to do like 2 book reviews.
Yeah, okay.
And then I honestly can't remember, but
yeah,
maybe.
cool. Maybe.
Yeah.
Well,
it's been a while.
I think it might just be helpful to put a bit of flesh on the question because when I had to like ask the lecturer so many questions to understand the question. But because essentially like some people, when we think about pastoral care, we might think about, and I kind of was one of these people, I would think about sort of a more specialized sub role within pastoral ministry. It's like, and even some churches might have like, there's a few pastors. One of them is the pastoral care pastor. And we think of kind of like counseling. We think of like one-on-one conversations and sort of helping people through a crisis or something. But then other people would say, no, actually pastoral care is way broader than that. It's like pastoral care is, I mean, a lot of that counseling stuff is more responsive, reactive pastoral care, but then there's a lot of proactive pastoral care, which includes preaching, it includes leading small groups, it includes like all this kind of almost all of ministry. So so I'm keen to hear your thoughts on how all of that works.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, so funny thing, we both had the same lecturer for the pastoral care subject. So my language, so you ask, what is pastoral care? And the way I would define it is, I think it's very typical of our lecturer. You can maybe he's changed the language, but it's like essentially, I think I see it as the care for the soul, and I think that encompasses many different aspects of it. But I think it really comes down to the care for the soul. If we talk about from a salvation perspective, right? Like pre-Jesus, our soul is dead, right? And so after Jesus, our soul has come alive, right? But then we want it to continue to grow and nurture the soul. And so I think our job as pastors, is to lead people to Christ. I think is one thing, but also to make sure that people are actually caring for their soul. And so I think it is like in terms of the practicalities, like it's the one-on-ones, like having chats and how they're going. Stuff like maybe there's a crisis or personal crisis, we help people through that. I think discipleship is a part of it as well, but discipleship can be its own, like, what is discipleship? So we won't get into that today. But I think it's also encouragement, right? So encouragement, teaching, preaching, but I think it's also rebuking as well, and it's teaching people, right, that this is not good for your soul, this is healthy for your soul. So I think it's we might think it's obvious to know what would be good for our souls, but sometimes, in this confusing and fast-changing world, we don't know. Like sometimes it's like we think it's good, but then we get caught up in it and realize that, this is actually not good for me, And I think that's with a lot of things today. Like they're good, but then if we don't use it well or properly in the right context, it becomes harmful to us. So I think as a pastor, and if we define pastoral care, I think it is really just caring for the soul. Yeah, cool.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Yes, I think our lecturer has retained much of this language.
Yes.
It's definitely soul care. And yep, my mind is going back to so many
Yeah.
lectures and books that are just floating around in my head. So are there any particular Bible passages that you personally or
Yeah.
like that you go back to as
Yeah.
like defining your
Yeah, for sure.
call?
There's the passage, and I'm just going to refer to because I can't remember off by heart. But
You haven't memorized it?
no, but it's like I think it's 1 Peter 5:2-4. So care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor. I think that to me really helps to frame and shape like, hey, what is my job as a pastor, as a shepherd?
Yeah.
And that, like God has entrusted these, this flock to me. And so I need to be responsible. I need to take care of them. It's like essentially it's being a steward, right, of the people that God has entrusted to you, and to do it eagerly and to not do it, with, begrudgingly or to, So I think there's the eagerness and the willingness is important too. Two more, I think Acts 20, verse 28. Very similar. Keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Be shepherds of the church of God, which he bought with his own blood. Again, similar to like just seeing the weight of the responsibility. Like, Christ paid his own blood for his people. And so it's just like how much, like we have to take this role as pastors and shepherds very seriously. And the last one, which might be a little bit of a left field one, but Proverbs 29 verse 18, where there is no revelation, or some translations say vision, people cast off restraint. But blessed is the one who heeds wisdom's instructions. And I think, to me, I think it's important to give people vision. I think it's important to give people that picture of what life with Jesus looks like.
Right.
Because if not, then I think they end up just, cast off restraint, or they lose that focus, or they don't know what they're looking or trying to attain. And so I think giving them vision, so that's part of preaching and teaching, and just to encourage them and say, hey, yes, you may seem like you're stuck in your sin, or you may seem that this situation seems so helpless, but this is who God is. He's our savior. He's our he's steadfast in love and care, and so I think it's giving a vision as well. Yeah,
That's very cool.
Yep.
One of the other subjects I'm doing right now is an exegesis subject on Revelation, which is all about vision. And I definitely sort of like I think that's a really good thought of. I feel like Revelation is you may be able to tell I can't stop thinking about it right now, but it's full. It's the world may look like this. It may look like Rome is in charge. It may look like Christianity is failing, is weak, but actually, when like John has this vision of just like the power of Jesus and God's sovereignty over everything. Yeah, so that's
right. Yeah,
that's very cool. Cool to think about that as like a key part of like what ministry is about, is having that seeing what our natural eyes don't see, and being making sure we've got our eyes on that. That's cool.
Because I think it's very easy, or maybe it's not easy, is the right word, but I think it's easy for us as human beings to get caught up with only what we see. And I think similar, that's what happened with the Israelites, right?
Yeah.
They only saw doom and gloom. They only saw the immediate, how life wasn't great in the wilderness, but they forgot all of what God had done before, and what God was going to do, and what God was doing. And so I think it's just that reminder of like, hey, we're so much like the Israelites. Like we forget, and we just focus on only things that we can see. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, this may sort of, maybe you've partly answered this,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm curious to know, what are your hobby horses as a pastor? Like, what are the like, what are the things that really just make your heart beat for ministry? The things that are just like, this is Pastor James. This is like the things that kind of the lessons that you really hope people get a hold of from as a result of being around you and being under your ministry, and like the things they hopefully remember after your
Yeah.
after you die, or after you move, or they move, or like.
Yeah, really, really interesting question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. Well, not in that way, at least. I think in terms of like, I'll kind of take it two parts. I think the first part would just be like what I enjoy about ministry, and the second part is what I hope people remember about the ministry that I do. And the first one is just, I just love having like pastoral conversations with people.
Yeah,
Like,
okay.
it's funny because I think God really changed my heart when I went to full time. So when I first became a pastor part time, I didn't want to be a pastor. Like, I struggled quite a bit in my first year
Okay.
of being a pastor, because I think I didn't want to, because part of it is like, I know the weight, I know the responsibility, and part of me feels like I can't live up to that. I think also as well, part of me felt that, because I was quite introverted, and I was just like, I don't like talking to people. Like, I can't be a pastor because pastors have to talk to people, have to talk to newcomers. And so I just hated doing that. But obviously God, over the years, probably took 3 or 4 years, changed my heart to then now I actually don't mind having like chatting and going up to like random people.
Yeah, right.
And like, I think a lot of it is, as and I think I've grown even recently, my time at AIG and stuff like that. Like, so I think God is growing me in that space. But I just love having those conversations with people, and because I feel like God is, and I don't say this to boast or anything. I truly believe that God has given me this gift, and it comes only from Him, where I'm able to really empathize with people, and like to really understand where they're coming from, what they're thinking, and then try to come up with some sort of like balance, or how to think, to bring them in, I guess. And so whenever I do one-on-one counseling, or even like couples counseling, even though I've never been in a relationship before, but I'm able to see the different points of views, and I say, hey, I think this is where you're not matching, and this is what you're needing, this is what they're needing, but like, you need to kind of come together. And so I just like, it's almost like and this is me like being an external processor. I'm like thinking about this. So I love troubleshooting. And in general, which is probably why I'm really good at like tech stuff. And so it's almost like trying to troubleshoot their problems. And so I'm just trying to find the solution. And I think that gives me a bit of a kick. I just love doing that, because when people leave the session or conversation, they're like, I never thought of that, or like, those are really good things that you brought up. Like, that just gives me like a huge sense of joy and kick. And I was just like, I was able to help them in that way. And that, I think that also includes like with people with, even just hearing about Jesus for the first time, and, meeting Jesus for the first time, something clicks in their head.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably a big thing in terms of what they remember. Like, I think for me, what often a lot of people say, especially when I preach, is that people say that I'm quite vulnerable and quite open on the stage and the platform, and that's something that I'm very intentional to do, because I think the last thing that I want to give off is that, because I'm a pastor, that I'm somehow better, which I'm not. And like, I struggle just the same as everybody else. I'm a human being. And I think and I've seen firsthand from my experience, when I've seen pastors be vulnerable and open, that encourages me deeply, because I'm just like, okay, like, I'm not the only one. And it's like, if he is like, he as a pastor is wrestling through it, then it's totally, not that it's fine to dismiss it, but it's like, I'm not an odd one out.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that I always try to tried to be and tried to do is to just be vulnerable. And obviously, there is a level of like, you don't want to overshare, and there's a wisdom piece there. But I think it is good to be vulnerable to people and to say that, hey, I was struggling through this. Because I think if you always paint a picture of like, you are, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that you are holier than thou, people would just think you can do that because you're a pastor.
Yeah.
But I'm not a pastor, so I can't do that. And so I don't think it gives them a good vision of what Christ can do in you and transform in you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd say like probably those things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a very fine art of like just knowing as a pastor, like how and when to share like your struggles, your failings, in a way that is like beneficial and not, as you said, like not oversharing.
Yeah.
And like, I was just thinking about this, how Paul can say in Philippians that that he has not made it. He's not perfect. And in fact, he actually that's part of how he defines maturity. Is recognizing that in himself.
Correct. Yes.
But he can also say, "Imitate me."
Yeah.
and so like he can say, "I'm providing an example for you of what it looks like to follow Jesus," and also I'm imperfect. And like, how do you do both of those things?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yes, for sure. That's true. Yeah.
So this is a surprise question. Which
Okay.
I haven't.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah, go for it.
Cut it out if it doesn't work. But just speaking of preaching.
Yeah.
And also, I guess speaking of like who you are as a person. I've heard it said. I can't remember who said this.
Yeah.
I can't remember even exactly what they said.
Yep.
But I've heard it said that every preacher has really 2 or 3 messages.
Okay.
That all their messages are really just variations on those.
Okay. Yep.
Maybe they said it's 5. Maybe they said it's 1. I can't remember what the numbers were.
Yeah.
But when they said that, I thought, oh yeah, that's true. Like when I think of like I don't know, some just influential preachers I know. Like they'd be like, they're always talking about grace, or they're always talking about like God's glory, or there's always something they keep coming back to. Even if I can get talk about people we know, it's like Sam, who's my senior pastor. I feel like one of the things that he always comes back to is like not trusting people too much in the right way. Of like trusting God
rather than trusting man,
and expecting people to fail. Because they will, because they're sinners. I feel like that's something he always comes back to. So I just wonder, like, what are your what's your 1 or 2 or 3 messages that you think are just?
I haven't preached in a long time, so my memory is a little bit rusty. One definitely comes to mind that I can think of is, I think, the emphasis of like doing things through the power of the Holy Spirit. Not doing things on your own strength. And I think it's something that I encourage a lot, because with every message, you would hope, with every preaching, there is some sort of practical application that you come to. And I think every time I'm always emphasizing that. It's like, hey, yes, we strive to stop sinning, but we don't stop sinning with our own strength. Like we partner with the Holy Spirit, or even if we want to evangelize, even if we want to do something big for God, we're not doing this by ourselves. We're doing it through the power of the Holy Spirit. And it's like, we don't want to do this without it, And I think maybe the reason that preachers have 1 or 5 messages, I think because it's something that maybe it truly resonates with them, that they really want people to grasp. And I think that's something for me that I'm also trying to remind myself, that it's like, hey, whenever I preach, whenever I do, like, I'm not doing this by my own strength. I'm doing this, And something that also maybe not a lot of people know about, but every time, I think I have mentioned it in my sermon once, but every time I go up to preach, before I go, whether it's the day before or literally moments before, I'm always having this conversation with God. I just say, God, whatever good comes from this, it is all you. It is not me. And so it's reminding myself that, hey, sure, like I may preach an awesome message, but people's hearts may not be open. And so it's like, so what? So it's like every good thing that comes from the message, like it's all through what the Holy Spirit is doing in that person. And so I just remind myself of that. And so I think it kind of links into that thing of like, doing things with the Holy Spirit rather than trying to do things by ourselves. Yeah.
Cool.
So I think maybe that's, I can't think of anything else at the moment. Nothing comes to mind, but
That makes sense. I think it's like, because I mean, as in when whoever it was who said that thing that it's not sort of a cynical or critical thing. It's like it's kind of almost just like a celebration of like this. Every preacher like this is just they're a living testimony to this thing. They just like their whole preaching career. They just keep wanting people to know this thing about God or about the Bible, about something. I just think that's really cool.
That is interesting.
But so okay. So we can start to get specific then about the area of ministry that you kind of are most involved in, and I know you've said to me that you really feel a heart for young adults ministry. Like you're pretty determined to be a young adults pastor. And so my first question is why do we need young adults pastors? Why should this is your job interview. Why should you have a job?
It's a really good question, and I think it's something that I think has to be answered contextually. So if you take the example of like if your entire church was young adults, then I would say you don't need a young adults pastor because your lead pastor is your young adults pastor, right? So I think in that extreme circumstance, or if your entire church doesn't have any young adults, then So I think when a young adults pastor becomes relevant and necessary is when your young adults demographic is a quite substantial size of your congregation. I think there are unique challenges and needs of young adults that would benefit from having a young adults pastor who is there to directly impart and teach into and speak into, encourage. I think it also depends on how your church is set up as well. So for our church, cell groups or life groups are a big part of how we, do pastoral care, community and all that. And so I would see that the young adults pastor in that context would provide a lot of support to not only members, not all the members, but some members, but mainly for the leaders so that they can then feel like they are equipped and supported to then do their ministry, and in leading and discipling their groups. So I think, it depends on your church, whether you need one or not.
Right.
But I think it really is when it gets to a substantial size that I think that's when the church might benefit from having a young adults pastor who is more focused on the challenges and the issues. And I think maybe just to add, I think it's when a young adults pastor is probably beneficial is when the existing pastors cannot effectively care for those demographics. So for example, like you could ask the same of why do we need kids pastors or youth pastors. I think when because obviously you have a wide generational, hopefully you have your churches, got different generations in it. And so I think it's when, the needs of that is like, when the existing pastoral group cannot, effectively care for those needs.
As a side note, just picking up something you mentioned, how like part of your role as a young adults pastor or even any pastor is like you're sort of overseeing the leaders. Makes me think of Ephesians chapter 4, where it talks about like the prophets, teachers, evangelists as equipping the saints for the work of ministry. Is that kind of a part of how you think about ministry, that you're
Yeah.
equipping other people to do ministry?
100%. Yeah, I think it's I think that's effective discipleship, right?
Yeah, right.
Because if we are to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them, then we hope that that continues to multiply, right?
Yep.
And so, yeah, and as the Ephesians passage says, we are equipping the saints for ministry. So I think a good leader and a good pastor is one that doesn't do all the work himself or themselves, but is there to train and raise leaders who are able to then do that and raise other leaders as well.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I guess you mentioned how like there can be a point at which in your church the senior pastor is just not really right, like fit or suited to particularly take care of a certain age group.
Yeah, or even just time, they don't have the time.
Or right. True. So I guess that brings up the question of like, what are the particular needs of young adults?
Yeah.
Like what do they need that 50-year-olds don't need?
Yeah. I think it's maybe it's important to define terms, I think, because everybody has a different definition of what young adult is.
True. What is a young adult?
Because I know even in some of the like Mandarin speaking churches, they still call some young adults youth. So
yes.
So for maybe for this conversation, we define young adults as anyone between 18 to 35.
Cool.
Yeah. So 35 some people would say up until 30.
Yeah.
But I think 35 I think is a good so it's a pretty broad spectrum when you think about it. You have someone who is like just started uni or just came out of high school.
Yeah.
To somebody who is like probably already has a family or looking to start a family, so it's quite a broad spectrum. So I think that in itself shows some of the need that through that time a lot of change happens. So you're going suddenly from coming out of high school, so then you're still trying to figure out who you are as a person, to then going through university if you take that path. And then out of university, you would find a job, or you can go straight to finding a job out of high school. And from there, you're still trying to find, what is my goal in life? What do I want to pursue as a career? What is, why am I here on this earth? A lot of big questions are being asked in that time. And then from there, it's like, and throughout that whole time, there's singleness, dating, relationships, engagement, marriage. That's another thing that, not to say you don't get in adults. There are definitely older adults who are single and still navigating that space, but it's more seen in this space, right? And so obviously you want them to do that well. Like the last thing you want is for breakups to happen all the time and not done well. So I think relationships and singleness is a whole thing. I think as well, work and how to see work is really important.
Right.
And I think it's important for all generations, because sometimes, especially you talk about the baby boomer generation, I think they just did work because they had to. Whereas now a lot of Gen Z, a lot of millennials, they have a choice on more choice on what kind of work, because life is a bit better. They're not looking to survive, they're looking for comforts.
Yeah.
Right. So all the basic necessities have been met. So I think again, it's a little bit different in the sense of like I think it's important to shape and form how they see work, and that work is part of ministry as well.
Because it's something they're just starting to do for potentially the first time.
Correct. Yeah. So, and I would say more specifically to today's age of like Gen Z and millennials, primarily Gen Z, is that the world that they're growing up in is so different. And so they're facing quite unique struggles that maybe, Gen X or, baby boomers would never have even experienced. You talk about social media, you talk about mental health, all of that, I think, factors in of like, okay, there's a certain amount of extra care that needs to be given, as well as support, to this demographic.
Yeah, well, that was my next question. Like, what are the particular needs that young adults have in the 2020s that previous generations didn't have?
Yeah. I think yeah, like mental health is a big thing, and like we chatted with Sarah the other week on the podcast about anxiety and like even though maybe anxiety is not new, as she said, but it is something that people are experiencing in a sense. Like people are being more open about it, and so which is a good thing. At the same time, it's like we because everyone is talking about it more on social media, and so being like, oh, maybe do I have anxiety? Do I not? And I think it's I think also social media hasn't helped anxiety. Comparison and all that stuff. So I just think the dawn of the smartphone really changed the world for better, but also for worse.
Yeah.
We're more connected, but also the most not connected as well, most disconnected. And so I think there is something to be said, especially for if we look, because I know Gen Z does touch young adults, but also does touch youth. So I think the current Gen Zs are anyone from the age of 12 and above. So 12 to 18 obviously is your youth.
Yep.
I think for them, they're specifically, they are dealing with a lot compared to maybe those who are like 18 to I think it's 27 now. So, but I still think we face challenges that Gen X and baby boomers would not have faced.
I think someone pointed out to me that like because I'm a millennial, I was a teenager when Facebook happened.
Yeah.
I mean, I had MySpace before
yes, MySpace.
Geez, if you want to talk about a recipe for disaster, the top friends thing in MySpace. Oh my gosh, the number of conversations. But yeah, someone pointed out to me that like, when I was a kid, I was a consumer, but then with social media, I became a producer. I became someone who puts things out into the world. But Gen Z and Gen Alpha, man, their whole life, they are a producer of things. Like they are a performer.
Yeah, correct.
Which is kind of scary to think about.
Yeah.
So I guess the natural question is how can churches meet those needs? What can churches do to help young adults in particular?
Yeah, I think it's a interesting question in the sense of like obviously every church is at a different stage. Yeah. So some churches may already be doing some of these things. Some churches like not even thinking about it. If I think about in a good way, I think COVID was actually pretty good for the church in the sense that I think it brought the really old churches a bit more relevant. They had to learn how to use a camera, live stream, and so I think that was a positive thing overall that, because therefore you're engaging and you're reaching a little bit more people than you wouldn't have. But I think, so I preface that, every church is at a different stage. But I think number one, I think this may seem like a basic thing, but you should be talking about topics that are relevant from the pulpit. So whether you believe topical or expository doesn't matter because your application and the way you relate it to modern day life is going to be, that's the most relevant part of it, because you could say like, you could purely talk about the text, but if you don't actually apply it to how that affects your mental health, how that affects work, how that affects your use on entertainment and social media, then I think you're not really reaching young adults and the struggles that they're going through. I think you can be strategic as well as, some people may disagree, but having topics, and so doing topical sermons. So something that that our church does for our young adults ministry specifically is we run we call like YA gatherings, so young adult gatherings. Right. And so it's essentially just like a night service, and we talk specifically about different topics. So so last year we did one on singleness, and then we did one on dating and relationships.
Very young adults.
and it's very targeted, and then we do like a Q&A on top of that as well, so that people have the opportunity to interact. Okay. And so it's just getting the conversation going on these things, because if we don't get the conversation going, it's never addressed.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's hard to do that unless you do it from a platform. And so if you feel that, okay, we just can't do that on a Sunday service or a weekend service for whatever reason, then it's like, oh, have a separate young adults night where you talk about it. Or if you don't have that many young adults, you can do it in small groups, where you say, okay, for this week, small groups, we're going to talk about money, which is what we did as well. Because I think money is also a very important thing. People are learning to manage money for the first time.
Yeah.
So I think, so it's just having those spaces where you can actually have those conversations, interact. I think as well as just educating the church about what young adults are going through. And because I think because I think one thing is that I would hope that natural discipleship happens. So in the sense that if you do, if you do have an intergenerational church, then you're not, like, naturally you would hope that your young people are talking to the older generation, and even teenagers and kids are, interacting and getting wisdom from young adults as well, right? And so the more natural that happens, the better. And I think that comes also with understanding. And I think that goes both ways. So not just, the older people understanding the younger people. I think the younger people also trying to understand the older people. And that just, breeds a very healthy church.
Yeah.
So I think, just trying to understand and get people to say, hey, this is what young people are struggling through. And, and also to recognize that we are different. And that's not a bad thing. And because I think sometimes, maybe this is more particular to Asian circles or Asian churches, but I think sometimes the older people, they think, oh, the young people these days, they don't know, or like, there's a kind of like, it's either that attitude of like, we're better, or there's the attitude of like, they could do everything. I won't do anything anymore. Right. So, but that's a bit of a side thing. But yes, I think it's, just trying to get them to understand, but also providing spaces and having those conversations.
Yeah. I think you touched on an interesting need there, which is one of the things that young adults need is old adults.
That's right.
Like, and they need also, maybe they need kids and teenagers. Like they need.
Yeah, we need each other.
That cross-generational
that's true
interaction
too.
is so healthy, as you said, like for a healthy church and for just like being a sort of having good perspectives as an individual.
Correct.
Where you're kind of aware of how different generations think about things and stuff.
And because we learn from each other. Like, I think it's important to learn from the older generation that have already lived lived in our shoes, but obviously the world is different. And so they can also learn stuff, from us about how to navigate this world, that, we would be a bit more equipped to, or younger generations would be more equipped to know how to navigate, So,
Yeah. Another interesting thing from your answer is I feel like some of what you've said would apply to the combined Sunday service for everyone. And some of it applies to like particular tailored young adults events. So like I feel like you're sort of saying it's good for the sermon on Sunday to in some way like cater to the young adults. And I guess maybe that could be not exclusively to young adults, but to like, I don't know, to everyone maybe. But I guess I'm now kind of wondering what kind of things on a Sunday on like the combined service, what kind of things might churches unwittingly do that scare away young adults? That keep them away?
Really interesting. I think there's so many different answers like that you could go into, but one that comes to mind, I think, is not being authentic. I think that's something that young adults can really smell and really know that this guy is not authentic.
Right.
And I think that actually puts people off, especially now when religion is something that is a little bit of a taboo topic, especially in Australia and Melbourne in particular. I think people are. I would say they're not. It's not that they're not open, but I think it's something that people are very like they hold at arm's length.
Yeah.
And so whenever they see any kind of sense of hypocrisy or sense of like you are not being true to who you say you are,
Yeah.
they kind of just immediately just like, and it's part of cancel culture, but like, they
Yeah.
just cut you off.
Yeah.
So I think being authentic and being real and being vulnerable from the pulpit is really important. So as you preach that, yeah, you don't give off that vibe of like, oh, I've got this down pat, but you don't.
Yeah.
Because then I think it just breeds that sense of elitism and that kind of like, I'm better, which they already have that preconception
Yeah.
that Christians think that they're better than them. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing is like just being, try to be relevant. It's almost the thing of like, it's always that balance of being in the world but not of the world. So it's
Yeah.
like there is something about having a contemporary service, however you want to interpret
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And because I think, yeah, like some people, like I think not to say that young people don't like more traditional services. I think there are definitely young people who do like that, but then don't count out the people who, like the service a bit differently. But having said that, I think that's why we have denominations.
Yep.
If what you're seeing at the church is not your vibe, then there's another church that will see
Yeah.
your vibe. So I think that's a good thing. I think in terms of a Sunday service, I think as well. Honestly, I think those are the main two things. Just being authentic from the pulpit. I mean, you could talk about worship songs and all that kind of
Right.
stuff, like the songs you choose, but I think there's enough variety and taste amongst young adults that I don't think there's a
True.
particular way.
Yeah.
But
So this is the young adults genre.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. I think a lot of I think it's generally associated that more upbeat hyper music is associated with young adults, but that's not always the case. There are definitely I know many young adults
Yeah.
who prefer more of a
Yeah.
calmer
Yeah.
worship
Yeah.
setting. So it's not I wouldn't say worship in particular, but I think I think it's just obviously contextual. Whatever is in your context. That's kind of just listening and hearing what, like just asking young adults, hey, what would you like to see happen
Yeah.
in our services that
Yeah.
you
Right.
think would be good for you? Yeah. So
Yeah.
you're just asking.
Asking. There's a good
Yeah.
idea.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Ask them. Yeah, I think that's really, it's just incredibly true what you're saying about authenticity in this, like in the younger generations.
Yeah.
And as Christians, we can't, sometimes we make fun of that, like, and we sort of talk that down, and it's like it can go wrong,
Yeah.
like the search for authenticity, but at the same time, Jesus was all about authenticity.
That's right. Yeah.
The word hypocrite was
Yeah.
is a common word in Jesus speaking, in Jesus preaching,
Yes.
but I feel it feels like to me, like especially since COVID, something changed in the church where not just young adults, but everyone is just like less impressed with like a big shiny
Correct.
church
Yeah.
service that's really hyped
Yeah.
up and like looks really impressive.
Yeah.
They're not impressed.
Yeah.
They're not impressed anymore.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe with Gen Z, that was already starting even before
Yeah.
COVID. They were just like, I'm not impressed by your big fancy
Yeah.
church service and
Yeah.
your big crowd and
Yeah.
your sort of polished sermon. Like, I want something authentic.
Yeah. And
I
I
want
think
someone to tell me, the truth.
Yeah, and I think that raises a thing that I forgot was that I think Gen Z and I was saying young adults, they're very much looking for connection.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big one too. And so if your weekend service does not have opportunity for connection and community, then I think there's something to be to rethink there. And I think that's really key because I think, and I would say like that's not only are they looking for it, I think that's what they need. Whether they're looking for it or not, I think they need that connection.
Yeah.
In order to really grow, because I think just listening to a sermon on a Sunday or a Saturday, whatever, is not really gonna feed you, and it's not going to keep you accountable. It's not going to
Yeah.
encourage you in the tough times. It's really walking together with other brothers and sisters in Christ who are, walking the same path, who have walked the same path, and who can, just you can do life together.
Yeah.
And I think, having opportunities in your service for young people, or just in general for people to connect, but I think even more so young people,
Yeah.
because that's what they're looking for, a place to belong.
Yeah.
And I think COVID really shifted that, because what I noticed was a lot of people were leaving the bigger churches
Yeah.
because I suspected that they weren't really connected to a small group.
Yeah.
So for our church, we've always had it from day one that we would focus on small groups. Like small groups we want everyone as much as possible to be connected to a small group.
Yeah.
And it was almost a culture. It was just a normal thing.
Right.
So then when COVID hit, yes, we lost the Sunday gathering and stuff. But we found that people were just meeting on Zoom and having like some cell groups were like 4 or 5 hour Zoom calls.
Oh, wow.
Because they just wanted to chat and spend time with each other.
Yeah.
And like it was such a natural thing. We didn't have to force it. People were like asking us like, how do we get past this 40-minute limit, on Zoom and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so like I think people were really loving it. And I think we also saw, we actually grew a lot because we had that in place already and people were looking for that. And so people actually came, other Christians from other churches. And, that's another thing. I'm not condoning stealing flock or anything, but I think that was just a result of we had small groups as a big, strong culture. And that's what people wanted.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, it's so profound, the reshuffle that happened like after COVID from big churches. Like I was part of a very big church and like post COVID it was just so many really fascinating topic. But I think it's also just I think it's worth highlighting for myself how you mentioned Q&As.
Yeah.
I feel like that could connect to the authenticity thing.
Yeah.
Where like there's a sermon where this person has rehearsed all of these words and everything, but if you ask them a question on the spot, they can only answer like something that comes from within them.
100%. And I think something which happened really recently. So we had a young adults camp and recently, and our guest speaker, one of the sessions did a Q&A.
Right.
And I was like, whoa, like that takes guts to like just open and ask whatever. And we were talking about, the gifts and the feeling of the Holy Spirit.
Oh man.
Not an easy
topic.
Easy topic. But like, hats off to them. Like they did so well. And I think that in itself is what young adults want.
Yeah.
That, as you said, but you would very rarely see that on a weekend service because it's just like, but to be fair, I think there's a sense of, it'll probably be too chaotic and there's limitations to that. But when you can do Q&As, definitely do it.
Yeah, it's such a, I mean, if you're the event organizer, like the idea of a Q&A is like, well, this could go really rogue. How do we screen the questions? And or who, like, is somebody going to ask a really inappropriate question? All of that. But it definitely just gets me thinking, like, is that something we should try and have a bit more of? But it is definitely a scary, especially if, I don't know, if you're preaching on like a theologically complex topic or something. It's like, if I'm going to be quizzed on this, I really want to know my stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
But speaking of theology, like one last question about just the needs of young adults. I thought it was really interesting how just you talked about like a theology of work. And like how that is that I'm like, oh yeah, duh. Like I never thought of that, but for young adults, for most of them, for the first time, they are transitioning into full-time work. And they need to sort of, I mean, it's also generally just a great point how just like young adult by their nature, like by the nature of that life stage, it's just full of change. It's just like every couple of years things change drastically. I mean, if you met me at the beginning of my first year of uni and then at the end of my first year of uni, I was not the same person.
Correct.
So many things change. But yeah, one of them is work. What do you like? I don't know if you can answer this briefly, but like, what would be some of the things that are helpful from like of what the Bible has to say about work, or what
Yeah.
you think is a good the kinds of things that young
Yeah.
adults need to know and wrestle with about
Yeah. Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. Um, yeah, it kind of goes back to something that was said at ARG by Pastor Dr. Philip Lin.
Oh yeah,
He has a church in SIB Skyline in Malaysia. He's actually spoken at our church a few times as
oh
well.
okay,
But he was saying that one of the greatest failings of the church is that we don't equip people for workplace ministry.
right,
And so I think not only young adults, but also everybody. I think we need to see work as the workplace. Sorry,
Yeah.
so work as worship, as well as ministry.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think, especially for young adults, kind of what we were talking about before, how they just see work differently compared to like Gen X and baby boomers.
Yeah,
So now it's like, I think young adults are really facing the question of, why do I work? Right? Because that answer isn't as easily answered compared to I need to survive.
Yeah.
And especially in Australia, we're very lucky. We have things like Centrelink. We have a lot of support and social services that are designed to help us in times of need. So like
Yeah.
we are very fortunate in that sense. But it is a question because a lot of our parents have provided for us. And so
Yeah.
we have a bit more luxury
Yep.
to ask the question and to think about and take our time on what do we want to do. And so I think that is a vast difference. And so guiding people through that, because I think one thing that a lot of young people go through is that they feel that work is such a slog.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like I find no, like they don't feel like there's any fulfillment or purpose in it. And because they feel that they've been told by their generation that work has to be, you have to enjoy it. You have to be
Yeah.
fulfilled. It should be your calling. It should
Yeah.
be, whereas like there is like, you just do work,
Yeah.
survive, get a pay, come home. So I think it is nice if your work lines up with joyful and what you want to do. But I think at the end of the day, we all need to keep an internal perspective that, we aren't on this earth forever.
Yeah.
And whatever time we have on this earth, whatever work we're doing, we should, make use of that time. It was really interesting. I actually had a conversation recently with a bunch of young adults about work and about ministry and how people were sharing their struggles with, they don't see their workplace as a ministry or like a mission field. And I think it's one of those things where I think it's regardless of where you're at, this is a bit of a side topic, but regardless of where you're at, I think what I just encourage them with is that ultimately, if you as a Christian are constantly being transformed, are constantly, being sanctified,
Yeah.
you're growing, you're changing, being made more like Christ, people are going to notice that.
Yeah.
It's when you stop growing and you are not living out a life as a Christian that people won't see that you're different. So the whole point is that we're supposed to be salt to the earth and a light on the hill, like a city on a hill and, like light in darkness. But we can't do that if we're the same,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it's a challenge of like, I reflect on my time at NAB or bank. And I found that it was very natural to have spiritual conversations because people saw that I was different.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, of course, I had the extra, don't know if you want to call it benefit, that people knew I was a pastor. So
Yeah.
I think people were just naturally curious.
Yeah.
But I think it was just the way that I carried myself.
Yeah.
It was the way that I talked. It was how I was able to, I guess, give advice from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
That people were like, oh, this is different. This is different from the advice that I get from my friend who loves to gossip and who loves to,
Yeah.
So I think it's
yeah.
about being just continue to grow yourself as a follower of Jesus, being made more like Christ. People are naturally going to notice that difference.
Yeah.
If you are working on your anger, and anger is an issue for you, if you work on that for a few months, people are going to notice that, hey, this person doesn't get so angry anymore.
Yeah.
Why? And so it's not that you have to smash the Bible at them. You have to like preach at them. But I think it's your actions, as long as you're continuing to grow, it changes you. So I think to kind of tie it all back in, I think it's trying to teach young adults that, hey, yes, number one, there's a practical aspect to get a job, to get money, to support yourself. Number two, it doesn't always have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be, I think if that's something that you want to strive for, that's great, but doesn't mean that you can only wait for the perfect one to come along, And even if you're in a place that is not ideal, make the best of it. Be a good steward of the time. We're talking about being good stewards. And I think I truly believe that God has placed us in different contexts, in different times for different reasons. And I think it's like constantly asking God, what do you want me to do today? Or how can I be salt today to my colleagues or in this situation? And so I think it's just asking that question. So I think when it comes to work, I know the ideal is always like, let's find our dream and, let's do whatever we want to do,
And never work a day in your life.
Correct.
Because you love what you do.
That's right. But that's not really the reality of this world. I think we still have to see that we're in a fallen world. And so work is never always going to be perfect. But we can definitely redeem as much as we can as followers of Jesus in that time. As I understand, it's easier said than done. And so I don't want to make this out to be that it's like, oh, you just have to flick a switch or like, you're a terrible person if you don't. But I think it really, I had that kind of almost revelation myself when I was talking to it, that it just starts with your personal relationship with God and your growth. And I think that will naturally always lead to conversations about.
Right. That's so true. Like, it's really interesting. I think lots of people are just waking up to this, like, and just independently, people in like our generation and younger, like, man, this idea that you need to, like, your career needs to be like this accurate expression of who you are, and it needs to be something that you just can't wait to get out of bed and go to work. Like, man, that is such a burden to carry, to have that expectation of life. Is like so. I definitely went through that whole thing, and it's something that like it's partly our just secular in the secular world that's been a thing, but also the church has kind of, in a lot of ways has sort of latched onto that as well, and we're sort of starting to realize maybe those expectations are a little too high. But yes, another conversation. It's a big conversation. That's good. But so, still thinking about young adults then, just what are the kind of, as a young adults pastor, what are the unique kind of challenges that you face as a pastor? Maybe you could also just talk, like, what are the challenges that pastors face in general? And then I wonder if there are unique ones that you experience when you're pastoring young adults.
Very pastoral care language, I think, is literally the care for your own soul. I think is probably the hardest, at least the thing that I face, which kind of led a little bit to my burnout. I think it's you hear the theory of it a lot of like, if you've ever been on an airplane, it's like put the mask on yourself before you help other people. It's that kind of, or like, always make sure that, if you're running into a fire, that you have protective gear, or else someone is going to have to be in danger to pull you out. All that kind of, conversation about you have to look after yourself before you look after others. It's so true, but I think it's really hard to do. I think it obviously depends on your personality type. I think as somebody who is very task-oriented, very driven, very likes to get stuff done, I find it extra hard to really care for my own soul, because my mind is just racing, and I think sometimes it's very hard to just slow down and to just be still. And I think that's a product of being a millennial, but also growing up in this day and age that we're in with entertainment and social media and all that. And so I think pastors have to be really careful, because even if you're not really involved with social media or anything, I think it's very easy to, because ministry never ends, to just let that sweep you off your feet. Because you could go and do 100-hour weeks and still not be done.
Yeah.
Ministry never ends.
Yeah.
And so really important to have boundaries in regards to that. I think as well, just like spiritual attack, like obviously you are guardians as well as, shepherds of the flock. And so the enemy is going to do all he can to try to steal, to try to disrupt, and to even make you distracted as a pastor and as a leader. And so I think number one, like, praying and fighting that spiritual battle, not just fighting, physical battles, but spiritual as well, is really important. And having people pray for you is really important. The fact that the church is your workplace,
Right.
but then your church is kind of your church.
Yep.
I think that's probably one of the most difficult things that most paid staff would struggle with.
Yeah.
Especially full-timers. Because it's just one of those things where, you are that's your workplace.
Yep.
So you see it as there are certain responsibilities and certain expectations that come with work. But at the same time, it's a Christian community where that lends itself to be a certain way.
Yeah.
And different from people who only go to church as church.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes it's a struggle to find a balance of how do you see that? How do you see church? And I think some people may not even consider that. They just think that, I don't think so deeply. But I know for me, it is something that I've been considering of just like, how do I see, like, because then it's important to know where to draw lines and boundaries, right? Because like, am I helping them because they're a friend?
Yeah.
Or am I helping them because of my role?
Yeah.
And because it's important to distinguish that, because you'll need to know, because I said ministry never ends.
Yeah.
So you have to draw a line, I think, when it comes to ministry. But then for friends and for people that are really close to you and you go above and beyond, you'll wake up in the middle of the night anyway to help them.
Yeah.
So I think that's a challenge of like, where's the line? Where do I draw it? And it's like, am I doing this as a pastor? Or am I doing this as a... And I think sometimes you won't be able to answer that question. Some will be gray. Sometimes it's black and white, but more often it's very gray.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just navigating that dichotomy is challenging. And also the fact that, like, in a way, unfortunately, church can never be the thing for you that it is for other people.
Yeah.
Because you are always, most of the time, giving. I think if you can receive, amazing. But I think it's harder to have the expectation to receive from church when you're the one, especially as a senior pastor or like the higher up you go.
Yeah.
It is harder to have that because then you'll leave disappointed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's why it's important, and that's why I've loved going to Flow because it's almost a church away. It's like a home away from home.
A church away from church.
Yeah. Like there's no expectation on me
Yeah.
to be a pastor. People just know me as James. Whereas at, Lifegate, I'm known as Pastor James.
Yeah.
So it's good to just have that separate, and some people don't need that. But for me, it really helps to have that separation. And yeah.
Yeah, cool. So are those sort of for general pastors, or are these things like you experience? Are there any like things you think just like for young adults pastors that you have to deal with this and other pastors don't?
Interesting. Like I think I wouldn't say there's much difference.
Yeah, okay.
I would say nothing profound.
Yeah.
Just more of like keeping up with trends.
Yeah,
like,
right.
I think that's a challenge. Because like, for example, like I'm not into TikTok and I don't want to get into TikTok. But obviously that's a big part of, Gen Z.
Yeah.
And so I think that can be a challenge in trying to relate. And now there's a lot of talk about Gen Z slang.
Yeah.
And it's like, so trying to keep up with that.
Yeah.
But I think there's nothing profound or anything
Yeah.
to, but it's just like, that's a unique challenge.
But it's important.
But
Like, it's part of it.
But I think maybe in the sense of, and I don't know how far I would take this, but I'll just leave it as a comment that, because there is the expectation to be authentic,
Right.
that can lend itself to some challenges of,
Sure. Yeah.
feeling, whether you feel that you can't do the role or, you feel like you're under a spotlight or whatever. Like that can lend itself in different directions. But that can be another one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I was having a conversation a while ago about youth ministry, and someone just said basically it's cross-cultural ministry.
Yeah. That's
which
right.
I think maybe not to quite the same, not the same degree
Yes.
of separation, but with like older adults and young adults, there is a crossing of cultures there, which is, I found a helpful way of thinking about it. It's like there is a responsibility there to know the culture that you're speaking into.
Because like if you're trying to preach, like for example, like if you take this stream of preaching to youth, it's like you're gonna have to think like them, and it's like that's a whole challenge that I think I would say maybe some older lead pastors would struggle of like, how do I preach to youth? And I even kind of went through a little bit of that struggle too when I was involved in youth ministry and preaching at youth. It's just like, like I think so differently from these guys, but that's part of the challenge.
Yeah. I guess this is basically the last question. When it does get challenging. And you've spoken pretty openly about how challenging ministry's gotten for you this year. What keeps you going? Like you're deciding to come back from a sabbatical. You're making this. It's not a permanent sabbatical. You're coming back. And I feel like you seem like someone you're pretty clear that you feel a calling to ministry. Even you feel pretty clear about young adults ministry at this point as well. What drives you to keep going as a pastor? Even when it is challenging.
Something that my senior pastor always said, which I think is so true, I think it's definitely good wisdom, is that the thing that's going to keep you in ministry is your calling. If you're not called to ministry, you won't last long.
Yeah, right.
Because ministry is like, he told me recently, it's a very thankless role, which is true. And it's something that is very tough to do. But having said that, when you know that you are called by God for something, part of that comes with, he's going to provide. Part of that knows that he's going to look after you. Part of that knows that he's not going to abandon you and he's going to be with you in the trenches. And I think that gives you hope, that gives you confidence that no matter what I face, I'm still going to be okay. And so, but you have to be sure of that calling, which is what my pastor always tells me. Like, you have to be so sure of that calling because, you would want to give up so many times because you deal with really difficult people, often in ministry, and you're just like, I can't be bothered. Like, I just don't want to do this. But, the reason you don't quit is because you know that, God has called you to this place, to this, ministry, and he will help you. He's not going to abandon you in that. I think as well is like maybe on a more, I don't know if there's a practical thing, but in terms of pastoral ministry in general, or even ministry in general, Christian ministry, is that the eternal perspective of like why we're doing this. I think having that as the goal of like we're here to save. Well, we're not here to save, but we're here to lead people to the Savior for their soul, and that's really key because then we're not just doing this to have a good time. Like we're like eternity hangs in the balance for people, and I think that also is a good motivator because then you're like, okay, I know it's tough, I know it's tiring, but the reason I'm doing this is because I want people to actually be saved. I want people to meet Jesus. I want people to have an encounter with God. And I think, one of my big motivators is when, people can actually have that encounter themselves. And I just love that, when people, whether that's for the first time, whether that's for the 10th time, I think when people have that revelation of God and when people, experience God in a new way, that always, is always rewarding. It keeps me going.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then I know that people are growing and their relationship with God is growing.
Yeah, I find a similar thing of like the fact ministry needs to be done.
Yeah.
Like someone has to do this. I feel like for me that kind of balances out that sort of supplements any uncertainty I have about the call.
Someone's
like,
got to do it. Yeah,
is it me? Like, well, it has to be someone.
yeah.
And so that kind of just when I'm not sure that like I'm not 100% sure that it should be, but well, it has to be done.
Yeah.
But I guess but obviously, as you said, like if you're really not called to it, like it's probably a pretty dangerous place for you to be.
And if anything, it'll be made very clear to you.
Yeah.
You won't last very long.
The best way to find out if you're called to it is try.
Yeah.
Although maybe that's the worst way to find out as well.
You don't want to be
go
burned.
Terribly wrong.
Yeah.
But that does make me want to ask, like, you and you've talked a bit about it, but like earlier on in this conversation, but how do you do you have a doubt that you're called to it? How do you know?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think at least for me, like, because I have thought about the question of, was what I experienced at that time, was that just an experience or was that a calling? And I think in my mind, I just know it was my calling.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that I can necessarily say or provide as evidence that to say this is why. Yeah. I just know.
Yeah, right.
And I think it's one of those things where, like, because I think God will speak pretty clearly to you if He wants you to do something.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I never wanted to be a pastor.
Yeah.
Like literally probably out of like almost out of high school, I was like, I never want to be a pastor. And so I think it's one of those things where if God wants you to do something that's difficult, He'll be pretty clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think so if that's you, if you're kind of like trying to determine, am I called to ministry? Is this something that, God wants me to do? I think he'll be pretty clear on that. I don't think he'll be too mystic or too, in the air. I mean, if you're not sure, just try. I think there's no harm in trying or like, getting your feet wet a little bit. Because I think that will also reveal like your motivation when things get really tough, because it will. You'll say, why am I doing this? And I've always gone back to my calling. I was like, okay, so this is why I'm doing this. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point there about the different ways God speaks.
Yeah.
And maybe one of the ways God speaks to us is he causes you to know.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just like one day you didn't know, the next day, for whatever reason, I just know this to be true. I can't point to any evidence, but God has just made me have this awareness of that this is,
that's right.
I am called. I just know it. So that's really interesting. One of the many ways God speaks to us.
Correct. Yeah. And I think, as you said, God speaks to people differently.
Yeah.
And so, like, I was talking to somebody recently at Flow about, like, they all God speaks to them through dreams.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, God speaks in many different ways. So I think it's, as long as we're open to whatever way, I think that's when God can speak. And for us to be sure, I guess, or to know. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess on behalf of the kingdom of God and on behalf of your church, probably, thank you for continuing and saying yes to the call.
Yeah.
It's obviously very important work, and we're thankful that you do that hard and often thankless work.
Yeah.
And I guess also that wraps up my questions. No further questions.
Yeah.
So thanks for letting us get to know you a bit.
Yeah, no, thank you for initiating this and for, I know it's part of your assignment, but for just like taking the time to think of the questions and because it's something that I've thought about doing, and so I was like, this has actually been really nice.
Yeah.
To do this on this place, and for you guys to get to know me a bit better, and but I think it's a good topic of conversation anyway.
Yeah.
So thank you for hosting.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks for
Yeah.
thanks for being on the
Yeah,
podcast,
yeah.
and thanks for having me on the
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah. Do you have any like final thoughts on just like pastoral care and and the role of pastors for yourself?
Oh, good question. Yeah, well, obviously, I have been learning quite a lot
Yeah.
um, about the nature of pastoral care. I think, um, yeah, it's been quite clarifying for me. Obviously, doing this subject and even just chatting to you, like
Yeah.
just how the term pastoral care
Yeah.
it really does apply to most of
Yeah.
the ministry. And obviously, theologians sort of talk about defining terms and
Yeah.
all of that stuff. And there's a big conversation, but also I think seeing the I mean, it was interesting. Like you had Sarah Clark
Yeah.
on a couple of episodes ago, and you talked about like counseling, psychology,
Yeah.
and all of
Yeah.
that, and um, I think you talked a bit about the difference between pastoral care and
Yeah.
counseling,
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
and that's
Like
something
the
I've
place,
been
and the role for that.
exploring, and it's a pretty
Yeah.
important thing, and obviously that's a big. I won't go into all of that, but it does sort of as you raised in your definition of pastoral care, just the place of sometimes rebuking.
Yep.
And I think, well, that's something a counselor
counselor
probably
wouldn't
shouldn't
do,
do. A
yeah.
psychologist
That's right.
would be
Yeah.
unprofessional to do that. But the role of the pastor is, and I've been reading Eugene Peterson talking about this, how the role of the pastor is to call people to worship and holiness.
Yeah.
And that's done in all sorts of ways. But it can be tempting, even just in like maybe especially when you're just pastoring someone through a crisis.
Yeah.
Like, what's my role in this as a
Yeah.
pastor?
Yeah.
It may not be to be an expert in
Yeah.
like relationships
Yeah.
or like an expert in thought patterns and stuff. All of that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
And like pastoral experience will give you some good knowledge about that. But what we need to be an expert in is the gospel,
Yeah.
who God is.
Yeah.
And we want to be summoning people to see Him rightly, see themselves in relationship to Him rightly, and facilitate that relationship.
Yes. Correct.
And it's like, but it's just very interesting hearing your thoughts about just like the calling to ministry.
Yeah.
It's stuff like at my stage of life, I'm in Bible college.
Yeah.
I'm like working part-time in ministry. Like I relate to so much of what you said about like, church being like your workplace being church.
Yeah.
That was a big step for me because I mean, it's a long story, but I just started, working in church ministry for the first time in 2.5 years ago. And that's an adjustment.
Yeah.
All sorts of things going on with that. But as someone who's kind of like I'm sussing out the call. Like what does it look like?
Yeah.
I feel a call to ministry. I feel, it was like ministry shaped. God's just built me that way.
Yeah.
But what does that look like in the real world? In the long term, we get to see exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just it's good food for thought. Just thinking about what role the call and like having clarity on that call plays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think because it just made me think of something like to add to what keeps you going. I think kind of what you said, like I think when God calls you to something, He's obviously called you for a reason, whether it's the gifting He's given you or, so I think when you are almost in your element, when you are doing the thing that God has called you to do, I think that motivates you to keep going.
Yeah.
So like, for example, like whenever I preach, I always feel, I feel that it's like, this is what I'm supposed to do. Like when I'm doing it, I just have this sense of like, this is what God has made me to do.
Yeah.
And I think there's a joy, there's something about it that you just like, I want to keep doing this.
Yeah.
And what that could be whatever, and Yeah, so I think that
Yeah.
definitely keeps me going.
Yeah, and just on like, it's interesting because I mean, it's just calling is such a huge topic and concept, but I while I am figuring out like the long term call, I definitely feel such a certainty that I am called to be where I am right now. I feel very called to be serving at Flow Church in this this time. I feel very called to be studying where I'm studying and like doing the things that I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
It gets hard sometimes, but I'm also just having the time of my life because it just feels so.
Yes.
You know, people because I moved down from Sydney to Melbourne to be part of all of this, and people are like, that must have been a hard decision, and it was. I was also like pursuing a music career. It's like a very long story, but it was a hard process to come to the decision. But when the decision was made, it was like it was actually pretty easy to come because I just knew. I just knew. Yep, this is right. I feel, you know, what people talk about. Like I felt a peace about it. I very much felt that, and that definitely, gets me through like when things are challenging.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think we'll kind of wrap it up there. But yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on and for hosting and interviewing me. It's been really, really good, and I hope hope all the viewers or listeners enjoyed it, and hope that it was beneficial to you guys as well. But yeah, wherever you consume this content, if you want to give us a follow, give us a like, we'd appreciate that. This is our 13th episode for the podcast, so we're definitely on a journey. Every time you like, every time you follow, it gives us indication that this is something that we should keep going and doing. Give us feedback. You can message us or email in. But yeah, thanks for joining and listening to the JC podcast, and we'll see you guys next time.